Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, journalist John McGinnis used to quip about the state legislature that it could have done less, but it ran out of time. We'll look tonight at the session which ended yesterday and if the lawmakers could have done more or did they do too much. We'll also look at some of the stalwart legislators who are leaving because of term limitation and the vacuum that creates. Elsewhere, a federal ban on Americans traveling to Cuba is bad news for the cruise industry and another delay for the rebuilding the link that once existed between New Orleans and Havana. And our Future Watch segment examines the status of local movie and TV production. On stage for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources, Stephanie Grace, columnist, The New Orleans Advocate, Don Ostrom, Channel 12's Future Watch reporter, and Tyler Bridges, The New Orleans Advocate. So legislature ended its regular session yesterday. Stephanie, what went on?
Okay, well, I think we're going to circle back to John McGinnis's comment about running out of time because a few things, interesting things happened when they were running out of time. But I would start with the big picture here, and that is that this session is not like any we've had under John Bel Edwards, and that is because...
And there have been a lot of sessions.
And there have been a lot of sessions. What is the number?
Edwards.
11 was this in 4 years. And the reason is that last year they finally averted the fiscal cliff. So it wasn't about how do we keep from making massive cuts. It wasn't a big fight about taxation. There was a small fight about taxation, but that was largely election year politics. So the good news is they were able to spend some money that they have not been able to spend more. Teachers are getting a pay raise. It's not a huge pay raise. It's $1,000 a year, $500 for support workers, and there's also going to be $39 million that will go to school districts as part of the per pupil funding.
And the pay raise was permanent, right?
It is permanent.
Okay.
That was one of the fights. So there was a Republican, not a Republican version because it was really the Republican House version, not the Senate, where the pay raise might have been a little bigger, but the per pupil money would not have been there, and it would have been one time. I mean, they could have done it again next year. They probably would have. But what ended up passing, which was John Bel Edwards' version of it, will make it permanent.
Okay. And then some other key things that got through.
There's going to be an increase in early childhood education spending, not as much as advocates like, but it's a start. Increase in higher education spending. There will not be a rollback of the tax from last year. That was something that some of these House Republicans who've really been at odds with John Bel Edwards tried. I don't know that they really tried. They took a vote on it and it won, kind of knowing that the Senate would not approve it and John Bel Edwards would not approve it.
Abortion legislation.
Abortion, that ended up being a really emotional topic this session, maybe unexpectedly, and that's really because of the national context that Anthony Kennedy's off the Supreme Court, Brett Kavanaugh's now on. The possibility of real restrictions or possibly even overturning Roe v. Wade is kind of much more immediate than it has been in the past.
And if I could jump in, what's really interesting about the abortion issue in Louisiana, as Stephanie well knows, is it's a Democratic governor who signed this bill with no exceptions. It was a Democratic...
No exceptions for rape and incest, we should say. There's an exception for the life of the pregnant woman.
And the sponsor of that bill is a state senator, Democratic state senator from Shreveport. And then there's an additional anti-abortion bill to put a question on the ballot, not in October, but of this year.
The following year. And that's by another Democrat, Katrina Jackson, who's a House member, who's an ally of John Bel Edwards. So...
and that would do what? That put it for a vote. What?
It's a little confusing. It basically would say in the Constitution that Louisiana does not consider abortion legal and to be paid for. What it actually means is unclear because if Roe v. Wade is overturned, there's also a trigger law. There's also a law that would make it illegal immediately.
Passed under the previous Democratic government.
Kathleen Blanco, yes. So what happened at the end was kind of interesting because John Bel Edwards, as Tyler said, is a Democrat. He's up for re-election. This is going to cause some problems with some of his base. There are some people who are very, very angry about this, and he really does need those people to show up for him in the fall, in October. So the separate constitutional amendment was originally supposed to be on the same ballot. At the very end of the session, the author, Katrina Jackson, pushed it back to next year, which kind of gets it off the table for the same election as John Bel Edwards, which I'm quite sure makes him happy.
Okay, Tyler.
The fact is unless a moderate to liberal Democrat jumps in his base has nowhere to go.
Well,
on
they
this.
could stay home. That's the question, and some of them are talking about it. So the question is, how will they feel in a few months? We don't know.
And if they stay home, they elect a Republican. so-
Exactly. So
Tyler, you have covered a lot about what's going on with Harris, and so that there was some resolution to the contract extension for Harris.
Right, there were 3 gambling bills before the legislature this year. The one that did get through, killed a year ago, extends the license for Harris to operate the only land casino in New Orleans for another 30 years, or at least that will begin in 2024 when the current license is up, and Harris is going to pay more money to the state. They are pledging to build a new hotel and invest $325 million. And then there was
where they put that new hotel?
on top of the existing casino, and this will all now. The city council now will have to play a role in the zoning requirement or zoning approvals that will be needed. So we'll be reading about that effort in the coming months.
And then also, was there something
sports
else?
betting, I think that was
Yeah, so
an
there was-
interesting. That's what I'm talking about with what happened at the very end of the session. And
Yeah,
Tyler
there's
had a good
always
piece on
something
that.
crazy that happens at the end of the session. They passed the budget bill with 15 minutes to go. The session had to end yesterday at 6 p.m. And so just after they passed the budget, then the question was, what are they going to do with fantasy sports and sports betting? These were separate measures, but Danny Martini, the sponsor of the sports betting bill,
That had failed.
Yes.
in the House,
He was trying to
in the
revive it.
Senate, he was able to tie that to the fantasy sports bill. So there was this effort throughout the day by the supporters of fantasy sports to untie the two, take separate votes on them, and they finally succeeded in the final minutes of the legislature to take off the sports betting from the fantasy sports. And the House then quickly passed the fantasy sports bills. And I should note that people in Louisiana, including in this area, approved fantasy sports in last November, but then the legislature had to establish the rules and the tax rate for the games to begin. So this bill had to pass yesterday, and so again, they were stripped off the sports bidding from it. You just had fantasy sports. The House passed it, both bills. The Senate appeared to pass the first one. There was some confusion. And then at 1 minute till 6 o'clock, Danny Martini, again, the sponsor of the sports betting bill, went up to the mic and spoke long enough, and the clock ran out. So not only did sports betting die to legalize sports betting in the state, but also fantasy sports, even though, again, it's been approved by most of the state.
47 parishes.
47 out of the 64 parishes is not going to be legal in Louisiana for any time soon.
Whoa, I bet a lot of
Yeah.
people are pretty disappointed
They
about
are,
that
yes.
and upset about that.
Well, none of that's not glamorous, but important. A lot of people are talking about the firm of Adams and Reese has a governmental watchdog wing, and they put out a press release today talking about the infrastructure improvements that were approved, and they described it as a generational shift. They said this was the most money appropriated to infrastructure in 30 years.
And this is money that came out of the BP settlement, $700 million for projects around the state. I think the big project in the New Orleans area goes to the port. Some people in Monroe are very upset because they didn't get a project. There are some big traffic-related issues in Baton Rouge that will be addressed. But it's not, what's interesting is that there was an earlier proposal to raise the gas tax, which would have gone towards infrastructure. That was a no-go during an election year, but this is a way they were able to shift some money.
Yeah, and what happens is the conservatives were the people who killed the gas tax last year, but when money is available from somebody else, whether it's BP or Washington, they're very eager to spend this money, and so they led the charge to spend a lot more money than was originally anticipated, with, again, the money coming from BP.
Okay, and then there's tourism, the whole issue
Right.
of
Speaking of
diverting
charging somebody else,
and
that-
also infrastructure, because some
Right.
of those dollars are going to go to New Orleans
So the
sewers and water
key to
board
that, and
infrastructure.
Tyler covered that in depth, but the key was really to say, you know, it's not the tourism industry, it's not the city residents, it's going to be the tourists who are mostly going to pay for that. And
Yeah, there's going to be an increase in the hotel tax of 1 percentage point. Then people on the ballot in Orleans Parish in October are going to vote whether to increase the tax on Airbnb and other short-term rentals by 6.75%. The governor's kicking in some money for one-time money, $50 million. Most of that money is going to go actually to pay past due bills from the Sewage and Water Board, but then the city will come up with some additional revenue, one-time money, and then also recurring revenue, as Stephanie said, by the taxes on visitors to begin providing more money for the city's anti-flood defenses.
And so that's something that the mayor, Latoya Cantrell,
It's
really
a
fought
huge
for.
victory for her.
Yeah.
Other previous mayors have tried to do this. At the beginning of the session, it really looked like the tourism industry and the mayor were at odds in a really kind of intractable way. Everybody was happy at the end because everybody got what they wanted at the end. The tourism people are going to be able to build a new hotel at the convention center, so that's a big win for them.
And they did not lose any of their revenue, the tax revenue that they get to market the city, which is something they didn't want to happen. So the mayor ends up a winner. The governor brokered the deal, and in fact, they had a press conference today where it was basically a victory lap to sign the bill and say, hey, we've done this great thing for the city of New Orleans.
Okay, and one other issue, and that was sort of a last-minute issue too, was a minimum age for getting married.
This was interesting because it didn't fall apart at the end. It already had fallen apart and it came back together at the end. There previously had been no minimum age to get married. This is kind of a national issue that a lot of child welfare advocates are taking on. Victims of incest and things like that. People are really just
Child trafficking.
Child trafficking. I mean, so there was a bill that was passed by the Senate. It was passed mostly in the same form by the House, but then it was amended by some people who were opposed to this to basically kind of get rid of most of the enforcement of it. So that bill passed. So there was a House version that kind of undermined the premise of it and a Senate version. It went to conference committee at the end. Some of the key people appointed to the conference committee had been part of that House effort to derail it, and yet they put it back together. So there will be a 16-year minimum age to get married. You can get married at 16 and 17 with parental and judicial control permission. And so it did pass.
So the 16 or 17-year-old, though, cannot marry anyone who is more than 3 years older than them. Is
it 3 or did they go to 4? Yes, I think it's
I read
3.
three,
It
yeah.
was, yes, it had been 4, it went to 3 or vice versa. But so then that's part of it too.
Interesting.
And that was a little unexpected because it really looked like it had fallen apart.
So overall, who won in this session, would you say, real quick summation between the two of you all?
I think it was a good session other than the abortion thing, which is going to cut both ways for him. And it's interesting, he really does not want to talk about it. He didn't bring it up at his session-ending press conference. But other than that, I think it was a very good session for the governor.
Well, and also just because, as Stephanie had mentioned, the budget issue had been resolved last year, and this is an election year, there was never really going to be a large effort to achieve a lot of things. So we're really kind of talking about a lot of issues that got a lot of attention, but really won't affect that many people.
Okay. Right, cauliflower rice and Uber
Cauliflower
regulation
rice
statewide.
What happened with the milk thing? With all
That
the cauliflower,
passed.
That passed too. So you
And the
can't
governor
have
is going to
soy
sign.
milk or almond milk.
The governor
milk just
said
comes from
there's kind of a
animals.
package of truth in labeling bills, he called them, and he said he would sign them.
All right,
I will
guys.
say he did not get his priorities of minimum wage increase and pay equity. That's again, so.
All righty, thank you. Good summation. A lot did happen over
Yes.
there in Baton Rouge. Errol, some people are losing their planned vacation. When you talk about winners and losers.
And some
Cuba.
people in Cuba are losing their planned income too.
Yeah, that's true.
During the Obama administration, that administration loosened the travel restrictions to Cuba, and so what had happened, you saw new businesses developing throughout the Caribbean with the cruise ships in the United States, planning itineraries, and for people on cruises, that's very attractive to finally get to go to see Cuba. And there's no easier way to get into a country than through a cruise ship.
Right.
Because you don't have to do all the passports and visas and all that, as long as you got
And
your
there's
little
no,
cruise.
you don't have to worry about them having
Yeah.
the tourism infrastructure because you stay on the boat.
And so, and so that was really a growing business. And then also among the Cubans, you always see these things about these vintage automobiles from left before the revolution that people still drive, a 1955 Cadillac. Well, now they're giving tours in those 1955 Cadillacs. And so there was a happy development until this week. The Trump administration, through the Commerce Department, just put a ban on most forms of travel into Cuba. A few things are allowed. Commercial flights are, because that affects people who live elsewhere and people who are doing business. But the cruise ships are clearly locked out of it. And
one of the amazing things was, like, the cruise ships that are heading there now had to divert themselves, had to come up with alternatives.
Well, it's good news for islands like Grand Cayman and Jamaica and the Bahamas and the ones that are nearby, but none of them have the mystique that Cuba had. But I think And the reason the administration did this is that they say that Cuba is still a communist country and that its military are still supporting regimes that are unfriendly to the United States, specifically in Venezuela and Nicaragua, and that they're destabilizing Latin American politics. And
You know, I've actually been to Cuba 3 times. The first time was in 1984. It was a desperately, desperately poor country, and the last time I went was in 2015. And enough people had started going to the country. Now you started to see the development of private enterprise, which is an interesting thing. You think that the government of the United States might want to support, but the country is so poor, the economy is in such bad shape that they desperately need visitors. So these kinds of moves are really going to hurt the country, and probably in a lot of ways hurt the development of the private sector that is just beginning to grow.
what the government is maintaining, the United States government, is that some of this funding is being diverted into the military. That the military is really bought into this whole system, and that money is being used for actions outside of Cuba.
Venezuela, yeah.
That's another story right there. Okay? But to me, the other story is the natural relationship between New Orleans and Havana. People don't think about it, but Havana is really a Gulf of Mexico city. You know, it's at that end of Cuba. Before the revolution, there was a lot of trade between New Orleans. There were both cities that had a large African population, a large Catholic population, and so they had a lot of a common culture together. They're both like, big sugar businesses at one time, and I think people were excited to see the trade possibilities and what it could do for the cruise industry out of New Orleans at some point.
Right.
Well, all of that is lost and probably lost for.
And effective, what, day before yesterday, so it was effective
It
immediately.
just came. It just came suddenly.
I'll tell you
Alright.
just real quick, you spend any time in old Havana and you feel like you're in the French Quarter. It's just, it's much bigger, it's dilapidated, but you really feel that connection to
feel.
New Orleans when you're there.
All righty. Well, we'll look a little bit closer to home right now. Movie TV production in the city of, in the state of Louisiana.
In the
New
state of
Orleans
Louisiana,
region.
it is, by personal counts, larger than it's been in the summertime in years. You know, last year we were talking about, will there be a cap? Productions that were scared, is the money still there? They don't, by any accounts, seem to be scared right now. There are at least 6 feature films shooting in the city or in the state. If you're stargazing around town, Tom Hanks is in Baton Rouge, Jennifer Lawrence, Russell Crowe, Wesley Snipes, Sterling K. Brown are all supposed to be in the New Orleans area this summer, shooting all kinds of projects. One very neat project, it's a movie that's currently called Coach Willie. Sterling K. Brown is starring in it, and it's going to tell the true story of Willie Davis, who was a janitor at a junior high school in Alabama and took over an almost victoryless basketball team and led them to be a state contender. Janitors. So kind of some good feel-good stories, a lot of World War II stories. The major media companies are expressing concern over the abortion bill that was passed in the legislature. There's no telling yet whether or not it really will steer them away or whether the tax credits are good enough to keep them here.
Yeah, and we saw expressions of concern about that anti-abortion law passed in Georgia, but we really haven't seen that in Louisiana, have we?
No, not yet. They haven't announced pullouts. There are also, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There are 10 TV productions being shot in the city right now, and some of them huge success stories. NCIS New Orleans is in its 5th season here, so obviously something is working right for the TV productions, especially season 4 of Queen of the South. These are productions that come in for much long, feature film comes in for a month or 2 and then is back out. A TV show comes in and shoots and pays for locations and pays caterers and buys up streets from the city and hires locals, and they are in for months and months and months at a time.
Allow me to note also, having spent time in Baton Rouge, that the state, the taxpayers, all of us actually underwrite a lot of that filming, and the economists think that actually it's not a good net return for taxpayers. But so, if I could just add that other note.
It's a lot of jobs. It is a trade-off, and the economists. It depends on which economist you talk to. The ones the state hires have said, it's probably a quarter per dollar or 30-something cents per dollar return on investment. Maybe not good enough.
But then you have something like Girls was called Girls Trip, the movie that, you know, kind of all these people came to Essence last year because they had seen Essence in this very popular movie, you know.
So those are the costs, just like having professional sports in the city,
Right.
that you can't explain that where those advertising dollars really go. Oh, that was filmed
even
in New
like when
Orleans.
they- when-
I want to go see that in New
Even
Orleans.
like when they
Or-
give tax breaks to big industry, you get those same kind of arguments
Or
about.
when the paparazzi, when People magazine shoots Jennifer Lawrence at a restaurant in New Orleans, and then it's, you know, what does that
What's the
do for
economic
tourism
value?
dollars?
Sure.
And who else comes to New Orleans because she's here or because Wesley Snipes is here? So there will be a lot coming out that will have a New Orleans stamp on it. Whether or not it will look like New Orleans on the big screen,
Right.
who knows?
But still, the production is here, and so there is some revenue generated, certainly for
Absolutely.
locals to work on those. All righty, Dawn, thanks a lot. All right, Tyler, I'm going to start this discussion with you. There are some legislators who've been they've been there forever. You really can't imagine them not being there, but they're term limited out.
Right, term limits are kicking in for a number of legislators, and number one on the list is John O'Leary, who has been the president of the Senate for the last 8 years. He was also Speaker of the House twice. When he steps down out of the state Senate in January, he will have completed 48 years
Wow.
in the legislature. Came here in 1972. Only
48
one other
years.
legislator in the history ever served 48 years. And actually, we don't know if Hilario will actually retire or whether he will actually run for his old House seat. We'll find that out by qualifying in mid-August.
He likes
but
to keep people guessing.
And so the person holding his old House seat, is that
he's,
person
he's also-
limited out?
he's term limited out. Yeah, Robert Billiot. And but there's a couple of state representatives from New Orleans who've had prominent roles. Walt Leger, he's term limited out. So is Neil Abramson. In the state Senate, we were talking earlier about the sports betting bill, and Danny Martini, who his last act as a legislator who had been here for 25 years in killing the fantasy sports bill. So there's a number of legislators who
I
are
would add
stepping down.
J.P. Morrell, who was really by far the most prolific bill filer anyway, and passed a lot of them.
Yeah, he's a very, very effective legislator. He's term limited out. So there is definitely going to be a loss,
change.
Yeah.
but the supporters of term limits would say, hey, good, we need new blood.
And so, like Leger and Morrell, are they saying what they're going to do? Could they run for another position in the legislature?
There is the problem, say, for Walt Leger is that he would be, I think he would probably be in Karen Carter Peterson's
Yeah.
Senate district, and she's not term limited.
Yeah.
They haven't said. Neil Abramson has not said. Walt Leger has not said. J.P. Morrell has not said. There is some speculation that some of them have longer term plans, but they also, you know, some of them have babies and they might want to go spend some time with their families.
But, I
They've
mean,
been-
these are powerful legislators, and you know, from this region. So, what's it going to mean for the New Orleans metro region to lose this power?
Well, let me just say, following up, I want to follow up on Stephanie said is that, you know, for the white Democrats from New Orleans, there's really not very many places you go as this state has become a conservative state. Mitch Landrieu faced that. You know, he looked at running for governor and he saw the numbers didn't work, and it's not clear where else Walt Leger could go or Neil Abramson
I mean, there are
could go.
people who I think would like Walt Leger to run for Attorney General against Jeff Landry and think he would be a strong candidate, but again, still in a Republican state, so not
Yeah.
an easy race.
But
by
you know,
any means.
that new blood argument kind of works both ways because the opposite of that is losing experience.
Yeah.
And especially a guy like Hilario has got a lot of experience. And I think we mentioned this before that an argument that people are seeing nationwide about term limitations is that it tends to make the bureaucracy stronger. That the people in the bureaucracy don't have term limitations.
And the lobbyists.
They're
Right.
yeah, the
Yeah.
bureaucracy and the lobbyists. And so it's not always everything that people think.
Right.
You know. And back in the days when you had like strong machine politics,
Yeah.
and a good machine can keep their person there forever, but you know maybe it's not as important. as it
Could
used
make
to
for
be.
some new dynamics in the
I
legislature.
think it
in
really
upcoming
will,
sessions.
especially in the Senate, because there's a whole big group. Again, we're 24 years into term limits, and everybody got 3 terms in each house. So this group of people who've been there for a very long time, starting in 1995, they got 3 terms in the House, moved over 3 terms in the Senate. Now they're leaving. The Senate has really been kind of the tradition, the keeper of the tradition in Louisiana, the bipartisan tradition that kind of worked closely with the governor, where the House has been more partisan and more confrontational. It looks like probably the Senate's going to be more like the House.
Yeah, with,
Okay,
with John
well, we shall
Alario
see.
leaving.
Yeah. All righty, guys. Over to E to wrap us up in this discussion. No Knicks.
Yeah, this is an interesting story. The crew of Knicks announced out of nowhere a couple of weeks ago that they're going to have a parade in the summer. It took a lot of people by surprise, apparently, including the city government that knew nothing about it,
Yes.
and then also a lot of their riders
Correct.
that was like they said, oh, we're going to have a parade, and they announced it. And this is going to be like a big parade. There are a lot of small parades that go on during the summer, and even the 6-month anniversary before Mardi Gras, there's some small groups that have a little neighborhood parade. This is going to be like a big parade, and then what they said, and there's really concern about what they do to the image of Mardi Gras. Like they said, they weren't going to mask, and that they weren't going to costume. They're going to wear T-shirts, and so a lot of people were very uncomfortable with this idea. Now, those kind of aesthetic arguments aren't the kind of things that City Hall grapples with, but the mayor came up with a very non-aesthetic but important argument, and as she says, it's a hazard because it's during hurricane season, and we can't be allocating the police for this, and so the mayor just said no, and so the whole thing was out, and so it was kind of an abrupt ending for an issue that wasn't handled very well to begin with. It does raise the issue. Does that mean nobody can have a parade during the summer?
I can't imagine who would want to. It's
Right.
so hot.
Right.
Just the strain on the paramedics alone dealing with heat-related
And
stuff.
then the members would have to basically pay twice if they want to
Right.
ride in the summer and then
Yeah,
ride again.
and there
It's
were all
expensive.
kind. Some people wondered, was this a money-making idea? Well, we don't know. They said they're going to give some money to charity. We need to watch out for, like, we're seeing a lot of people doing things and trying to justify it by charity. But because it's charity, doesn't always give you a blank ticket to do
and so
something. But anyway, so
Bottom
there'll
line,
be no Knicks.
no Knicks in the summer.
this year.
But regular Mardi Gras season,
Right,
they'll
right.
be going strong. Okay, looking ahead.
So much better would be a nice cold beer, okay? And a brewery in Mid-City, Second Line Brewery, has announced a new beer. And Marcia, I thought you'd be interested in this. It's privateer beer. It's being
yes,
done
that's great.
in conjunction with you.
That's terrific.
They describe it as being light and thirst quenching. It's available on the UNO campus, at Katie's, and at Bromarts and places around town.
Yeah, he told me it was a surprise. It is. Steph.
It's swim season at Nord pools, and there was interesting kind of social media commentary that really blew up that some kids who don't have proper swimwear are getting turned away. So the Nord Foundation has started a swimsuit drive. They're collecting swimsuits for these kids. They show up to the pools. You can go to the Nord Foundation website and check it out.
Thanks a lot, Steph.
It's way in the future, but the American College of Cardiology that was in town in March 2019 was scheduled to bring its 18,500 or so people back in 2026. They've now also rebooked earlier for 2023.
Okay,
They had
great.
such a good time.
We welcome them. Tyler.
So Mayor Cantrell is going to be announcing next week, now that the city's getting this infrastructure money, how they're going to start spending it and look for an election in the fall on short-term rental, and then down the road a drainage fee on the ballot at some point.
Okie doke. Thanks, guys. Very interesting conversation today. Thank you all for joining us. And we will see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.